This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Trustee Handbook Book Club After Party Part 2. This is a pre-recorded session with the Handbook team where we'll ask and answer all the questions that we were unable to get to during earlier book club sessions. In this recording, we have questions coming from the topics of budget and finance, facilities, policies and risk management, ethics, conflict of interest, intellectual freedom, censorship and privacy, planning and evaluation, and PR and advocacy. If you haven't watched these sessions yet, you can head over to midhudson.org/trustee book club for all the recordings as well as the toolkit. As always, we have Brian Hildreth and myself moderating the discussion, and our library experts and authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich and Jerry Nichols, are here to answer questions. Hey, team, how are we all doing today?
Pretty good. Glad to see you.
Thank you, Ron.
Glad to see you too. All right, we're going to jump right in. And the first section of questions that we have are on budget and finance. So Jerry and Rebecca, can an executive board, 4 members, conduct business without a quorum of the board in general? And if so, can they make financial decisions?
Well, I'll lead with this one. The Education Law 226 Subdivision 2 actually clearly defines the ability of a library board or any educational institution in the state of New York to appoint an executive committee. But it has to have at least 5 members. And the other most important thing within that law is that the trustee, the entire board, needs to authorize that executive board to do specific things. For example, they need to authorize, they can pay bills like during the summer, or but they need to authorize specifically the powers that that executive board can have. And again, you cannot have less than 5.
I think the other thing I'd add to that, I want to stress that authorization thing. And I think sometimes boards hope they can just give the executive committee blanket authorization to do certain things. And you might be able to do that for something like a construction project when you need to make very timely decisions. But for the most part, you don't want to give away your power to an executive committee for the most part. So make those authorizations specific. And it does very clearly say in the law that that committee may not make removals of trustees from the board. So if someone's irritating the executive committee, they don't have the power to remove them regardless of that authority that's been granted.
Right, good point.
All good points, yeah. The next question we have for budgets and finance. When large sums of money, let's say $100,000 plus, are left to the library, where's the best and most transparent place to deposit the funds where it can draw interest while still being available for immediate use?
This is what a problem to have. What can I say? It seems like an awful lot of money to need to have around for spare change, that you need it immediately. But if you do need it immediately, you got to have to put it in a bank unless you have, if you're an association library and you have an investment counselor, and quite often they will have a money market account which you can access easily. You can write checks off. But really, there aren't that many options for you to have immediate use of cash like that without giving up a lot of interest and using a normal financial institution. Indeed, that amount of money, I'm sure you'll get money in a checking account. You'll get interest in a checking account too. But I would, though, quickly develop a cash flow of what you need that for, and at the very least, ladder some certificates of deposit over so little money comes available each month if you want. But it just seems like excessive cash on hand.
I think once the money's been given to the library and the library touches it, it's yours. Like, you have to own it and put it to the best advantage of the library. For some libraries, though, some create kind of an alternative structure for taking in larger donations or gifts of stock, which public libraries can't hold. So I would definitely advise getting familiar with your community foundation. That's something that we advise here for our libraries in the Mid-Hudson library system. For public libraries who are looking for higher yield accounts, sometimes the community foundation as a vehicle to have a donor advised fund can hold money for you with the library, members of the library board's executive committee acting as the advisors for the fund, which means you can withdraw the money fairly quickly, but it could result in higher yields than a public library can get otherwise. But you have to be very, very careful about that to make sure you haven't touched the money before it goes there. A public library at least, can't turn over money to something like the community foundation.
Right.
I very much like this next question because it's talking about library audits. And I didn't necessarily ask a similar question to Jerry, but I was asking him a bunch of questions about these types of things, and eventually just said, here, look at these. And they were all the library audits, and it's so great to receive an email every week that just kind of lists a bunch of audits in it. But the question is, where can I find and review library audits? Should these be reviewed by individual library boards to help consider areas of improvement?
Well, we will provide a link to where you can see them all. Have fun. As I mentioned, it'll either help you sleep tonight or keep you up at night, depending on where you're coming from. Rebecca, you probably might want to chime in on this too. I don't think individual trustees should be in the weeds on looking at audits. There are some wonderful documents available, and I know that Mid-Hudson has one that's a checklist of things that areas of concern for audits and whatnot. I don't know that this is the kind of homework trustees should be doing. Maybe you should be doing it as a director, or I'm sure your certified public accountant has been doing it, assuming you have one.
I think directors can certainly learn from it because it will deal with some very procedural issues that are at the appropriate level for a director to be learning more about. For trustees, though, what I'm going to do is share with you, I'm willing to take thanks at any point here, folks, but I've read every single library audit ever issued by the Office of the State Comptroller, and I've themed it out. So I have the top 5 trends that repeat over and over and over again in these audits. That's the level of information that I think a board might like. So I'll share that along with the recording so folks can see those top 5 areas that boards should be concerned about, which relate to policy.
And that's one that I use regularly when boards ask, well, why do we need to consider these ones? And I can let them know that Rebecca Smith Aldrich has read through all of these, and here are the highlights that keep coming up. So if you're audited, these are going to be what they're going to be looking at.
And just sneak peek, the number one thing that comes out in these audits are that boards don't follow their own policies. So let that be a lesson to you.
Write them, approve them, and then follow them. Very good. Okay. The fourth question I have. So the trustee handbook says that often end of year surplus from the operating fund is transferred into a capital fund for future use. What else can you do with the surplus besides putting it into a capital fund?
I guess I'll start with this one. You can do a lot of things with it. First of all, we recommend that you hold a sufficient amount of money for cash flow, depending on when you get your tax monies. In my area, I've always recommended at least 3 months because sometimes you don't get your tax monies in a timely fashion, or the schools, if you get tax anticipation notes, don't cooperate. That said, the rest of the money should be designated to specific reserve funds that are established by the board in a public meeting. And these reserve funds, besides capital funds, are any number of them, anywhere from an unemployment fund to a post-employment benefit fund to reserve for sick and vacation time fund, and on and on and on and on. But the one thing that you should know, and you should talk to your accountant about, is that the GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, does have a standard for the use of these funds. It's called GASB 54. Your accountant knows about it. You should follow it so at least your community knows where the money is and that you're handling it in an appropriate fashion. Rebecca?
I can't recommend the Office of the State Comptroller's guide on this enough. Their reserve fund guide, it's called the local government management guide on reserve funds is so helpful because it lets you know what legally allowable reserve funds a library can have. And there's some things that you might not have thought of that you really can get hit with. So for example, if you've got a longtime employee that's accumulated a lot of personal time off, PTO they haven't used, and you have to pay that out unexpectedly during a financial year where you hadn't planned to, it can really wreak havoc with your budget. You're allowed to have a reserve fund to put money aside to pay out PTO payout. So that's something that we recently put into place here at Mid-Hudson, and it's been a game changer for me because I don't have this like mid-year hit that I didn't expect. So highly recommend that item, and I'll add that to the recording archive as well for folks to access. But I can't, I think we talked about this an awful lot during the recordings, but you know, it's that planning process, like where should cash be going and being invested? Where would it be nice to invest cash where you can't currently do so, and making sure you're planning accordingly. So the reserve funds are always a good spot, but I think also making sure you're doing a retrospective look that did you adequately budget for the goals that you have in your plan of service? And if not, can you smartly use those funds not only to make sure your reserve strategy is strong, but that you're budgeting for the next year appropriately to achieve the goals that you've laid out for yourself, both from the capital plan perspective as well as your programmatic plan.
I'm going to digress a little bit. Every library should be having an independent audit every year, and the auditor should come to your library board and present the audit. And part of that conversation should be this: planning ahead, putting aside money for those unexpected expenses, for those retirements that came out of the blue. And so I think this is all part of what Rebecca's saying. It's a package. This is a part of your plan. It's a process at all times. And but you have quite a bit of flexibility in setting up these reserve funds. One other quick thing: once you put money in a reserve fund, you can move it to another reserve fund with a vote of the board in a public meeting. So it's not set in stone.
Right. Thank you. The next one is seeking competition procurement. Is there a state set bid threshold, or is it set by the individual library?
Well, public libraries.
Should we all say it in concert? It depends on the type of library you are.
The state sets a bid threshold if you are a public library, in other words, a school district, special district, or municipal library. It's $20,000 for supplies and materials, and it's $35,000 for services and materials. So if you're buying copy paper, it's $20,000. If you're building a bathroom, it's $35,000. And there, again, this is another one of those wonderful publications that Rebecca likes so much from the controller that we will have on our after party crib sheet when we post the video.
I think it's important to note there for the public libraries following that general municipal threshold, that's cumulative. So for example, it's not just if you're thinking to yourself, well, we're not going to buy a $20,000 computer. But if you bought $20,000 worth of computers over the course of 12 months, that would have triggered the need to go out to bid. So make sure you've got those larger or bigger budget item plans in place at the beginning of the year, so you know if you're going to dance around that threshold. And I think boards will want to set policies, as do association libraries, for when you need to get multiple quotes on something, or when you might want to trigger a bid process for an association library. So there should be a local procurement policy as well as knowledge of this law to make sure you don't run afoul of it.
Yeah. Furthermore, if you're a public library, you by the controller's direction, you need to have a procurement policy, and that is one of these areas that they're going to check when you get audited. I didn't say if you get audited, when you get audited. And yes, you might not have to go through a formal bidding process, but there are thresholds that you at least have to ask for a quote, or at least a telephone call, and ask for three quotes or whatever. And so that's important for you to follow, because they will spank you on that if you don't follow the rules. The other thing that Rebecca said, dance. Yes, a lot of people do want to dance around this. They'll start the bathroom in June and then pay half of it, and then it'll finish it in July and pay the other half. That does not fly. You can't split your project over 2 fiscal years and think you're going to get away with avoiding the bidding.
All right, and that was the last of the budget and finance questions. And Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you to ask some questions about facilities.
Yeah, so now we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about facilities. This first question falls under facilities, but it also falls under that wonderful umbrella of policies. So is it legal for the board to authorize a for-profit entity to use the library meeting room to host a meeting where the entity will be making money? So yeah, definitely a policy question.
Rebecca, you lead.
So I think there's two parts to this question. One is, do you allow businesses, not just nonprofits, to use your meeting room regardless of purpose? Let's start there. So making sure your policy, your meeting room policy, is really clear for the purposes for which your building and your facility meeting room is you're willing to allow it to be used for. That's one thing. And you want to be consistent about all nonprofits or all businesses, one or the other, whatever you decide to do. A growing number of libraries are allowing businesses to use meeting spaces for a variety of purposes. They are community members as well and contributing to the local economy. The people are making money using your technology and the knowledge they get off your shelves. Perhaps your meeting room should be reconsidered if you're not currently using it for for-profit use as well. The caveat is you may not have folks that are charging to come in to their event in the library space. So if you've got a for-profit entity that you've allowed to use your space, everybody in the community is allowed to come in there without paying the price of admission. So I think you'd want to be really careful in thinking about what the purpose of the use is by the business. That's what you can legislate through library policy, perhaps more than keeping businesses out of the library.
And where I know we've got a municipal bond question coming up, so a quick caveat. Many libraries, when they when they issue municipal bonds on behalf of the library, one of the caveats is that you cannot use the facility for certain profit-making purposes. So just be aware of that. If you are a school or special district or municipal library that is the building was built with municipal bonds, there might be a restriction.
And it speaks to the whole purpose of a public library. It's for everyone. It should be for everyone, regardless of your ability to pay. So anytime you create an environment, even when you're giving the perception that you have to pay to be a part of something going on at the library, I think you're headed in the wrong direction. We just had this conversation with one of my libraries where it was a dicey issue because they have musicians that come in who ask for donations from the audience after their free performance at the library. And are they crossing a line because it gives the perception that you have to pay to be there? And would you feel uncomfortable if you didn't give a donation at the library's program? So I think it's best to move that point of sale aspect or attribute from a program or a service at the library whenever possible to avoid people thinking they have to pay to use the services of the library or attend programs at the library.
Yeah, and before we transition this next question, I mean, the one thing that I would add to that is it all ties back to mission. You know, a lot of these questions we answer with, you know, it depends, and not just only what type of library you are, but also your community and the way that you're trying to connect with your community. So, you know, taking a look at your plan of service, looking at your mission. That's why when we talk about responsibilities, we say, you know, create your mission in tandem with your plan of service. And so when you're looking at those policies and you're trying to make certain that you're meeting the needs of your community, not only patrons, but also the business community as well, how can you incorporate them into the services that you're providing, but also making sure they're being a good partner as well as steward of the policies that you're creating as a board altogether.
Well said, Brett.
So the next question I'll ask is, what advice would you have for a school district public library that has no money in capital reserve fund, but the building has a significant number of issues? Would it be more prudent to raise our tax levy to cover the overall cost of repairs or investigate bonding for upgrade and repair? So do we raise taxes or we go out there and try to issue a bond? Just a different way of collecting taxes.
Yeah. Rebecca, I think we're both on the same page with this one. I'll let you, and then I'll take the next one.
Okay. So I think in this situation, if you've let those repairs slide for a very long time and you've got quite a pileup of things to get done to a pretty high price tag, I think increasing your annual tax levy to tackle that, it probably isn't the best approach. You might need one-time funding, perhaps through a bond, to cover that, reset the building, get it back into fighting shape, as we say. And then from that point forward, think about a reasonable increase to your annual operations levy to make sure you're keeping up with the upkeep of the building and end of useful life issues with HVACs and roofs and all those major systems. So I think it's obviously there's caveats to this question we don't have all the information for, but I think a reset would, if you need a big amount of money all at once, the bond makes sense, because if you do the annual amount and you ask for that big amount and you're getting that annual amount again up there at that level for the foreseeable future, that's unjustified. I don't think that's fair to the taxpayer.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we always try to educate boards on is this idea of like piecemeal. Like if your building has so many of those different things that need to be done, and it can't be accomplished in a short period of time, or even over the period of like 2 to 3 years through public library construction aid. I mean, the best thing that you can do is start that conversation, not only within your own board, but with your director and staff and even community members about what does it look like to not only envision, but also re-envision what that public library looks like to the community physically over the next 100 years. And you come up with some answers that say, hey, we need a new building, or we really need to make sure that this existing building is in solid shape. That's when you start talking about the bonding issues. And that really leads us into our next question, which is, what does it mean to bond for a capital project? I understand it is a way to receive money from a funding authority, but what's the process? Who do we talk to, and should we involve an attorney?
I told my colleagues to try to keep my conversation on this to less than an hour and a half. So I will endeavor to do that. Little background, we're referring to municipal bonds, and they are a way to borrow money. This is not free money. And yes, you need an attorney right up front. You need more than one attorney. You need an attorney to represent you. If you're bonding through another agency like the school district, they'll have their attorney, and then you're going to need a bond counsel, which is a special attorney, which costs a fortune. In effect, what municipal bonds are is they take advantage of federal and state tax laws that encourage public works by allowing people to borrow money through a device called a municipal bond, and the people that buy the municipal bonds will get interest on them, but not have to pay taxes on them. So they'll often be called triple tax exempt, meaning no federal, state, or local. So that way the interest rate's low. And these days you'll be looking for lower interest rates at the rate we're going. So the process, really, we have to start back with depends. What kind of library are you? So if you're a municipal library, you're going to bond. If you need a bond, you're going to have to go through your municipality. They'll do it for you. And it's entirely up to them. And they do a lot of bonding because that's how they rebuild the roads in your town. So that's something that they control. If you're a school district library, the law very clearly requires the school to bond for you with the approval of the community if you need a new facility. Now, they're doing it on your behalf. Now, by the same token, if you're a special district, your legislation probably said you're going to bond through your town. Now, don't for a minute think that they're going to do it free. There are a lot of expenses involved in this. And so we don't recommend bonds for less than several $1 million, frankly, unless you're going to piggyback with some other libraries and or your schools or your town. So, but there's also different avenues. If you are a school district or a special district library and you have availed yourself of legislation to allow you to do so, you can bond through the Dormitory Authority of the state of New York, which is another process, but it requires a lot of attorneys and financial advisors. And then finally, if you're an association library, many of our association libraries around the state agencies, but that has able to bond through industrial development ceased to exist. There are communities in many of the counties, and you can bond through them. But once again, yes, you need an attorney for the library, and you need a bond counsel, and if you're dealing with the town or the school district, they'll find a bond counsel for you. Same with the DASNY. They have bond counsels. It's a long, expensive, worthwhile project for the right amount of money, but you need expertise. You do not do this yourself. Anything to add?
I would just
quiet.
encourage folks that have the right to do it to use the mechanism that's been presented to them. I can't tell you how many boards I speak with that say, oh, we're going to avoid the bond and just fundraise for it all, and we'll eventually get there, and we'll eventually build the building. And if you've been given the privilege of having access to the bonding mechanism, yes, it's work. Yes, it's expensive. It's still less work than a capital campaign in most cases. So I urge boards not, is it work? Absolutely. Do you need to pay out money to help get expertise, help with your bond attorney and other lawyers' fees? Absolutely. But the transparency of it, the buy-in from the whole community, the timeline within which you can achieve it is all, I think, much healthier for the organization and the community. Capital campaigns are a labor of love. They will take sometimes upward of a decade. It's a very long effort that sometimes means you're not providing quality library service in the interim. So unless you absolutely have no other choice but to do that capital campaign, I urge you to learn about the bonding process. It is worth your time to learn more about it.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Jerry. Ron, I'm going to turn it back over to you now for policies and risk management.
Yeah, great. So for policies and risk management, the first question that I have for the group is, can a library trustee be held individually liable for a decision or inappropriate behavior made by the library board? And how does D&O or errors and omission insurance play a role into this?
So let's start with type of library again. If you're a public library and you're a trustee, you're a public officer, and you have some coverage under public officers law, and the library would cover your legal expenses. We're not getting to the cause yet, but directors and officers liability insurance would pick up the tab so the library doesn't have to pay for whatever errors that you've made or issues that you found guilty of. But D&O does not cover you for breaking the law. It may cover you for, you might have done a wrongful termination that that you'd be covered for. But if they found you with your hand in the kitty, no. The other thing that insurance, and I defer to my longtime friend who was an insurance agent who put together a library group, the Utica Group insurance company. He said, you're not insured for underinsuring yourself. In other words, there's no insurance for not having enough insurance. So, and that is a liability that's on you guys. If you cheap it out and you have a loss, they're only going to give you and somebody then sues you because you weren't sufficiently covered, you've got a problem. So you should have a part of your team should be a good insurance agent, and you need to thoroughly understand your directors and officers liability insurance. And one real quick other caveat, a lot of times insurance agents like to churn, that's the term, churn policies because they get a piece of it every time you get a new company. One thing that a lot of libraries are not aware of is that quite often when they churn that directors and officers policy, the new insurance company is liable as of that date, not for something you did 5 years ago. And the old insurance company is gone. So you need to be aware that you want to have a continuity of coverage when it comes to your directors and officers liability insurance. And once again, if you do something that's totally egregious and against the law, don't expect the insurance company to get you a criminal attorney. Rebecca, you got anything to add on that?
Not on that one. I actually learned something from you during that answer about the continuity of coverage. I think this is one of in our essential trustee workshop we do in Mid-Hudson, when we give our folks homework to go back and ask some questions. This is one of the questions we always have them ask. Do we have directors and officers insurance? Because it's something you certainly don't want to be caught without.
And by the way, if
All
any
right.
of you are volunteer for a lot of other boards, because I know very few trustees that only do one thing. When you go on to another nonprofit or any, ask them, am I insured? It's important.
The next question we have for policies and risk management. So the list of recommended policies in the trustee handbook seems excessive for our small library. Could the board skip certain policies that they deem are not applicable to our situation?
I'm going to sit back and enjoy listening to you guys talk about this one.
I know, and I
Rebecca,
really
start
want
us
to
off
invite
with this one.
Ron and Brian to help me with this one because we have a lot of small libraries too. And I get this question a lot. I wish I could tell you could pick and choose which ones you want to do, but that list is not something that we gleefully add to. It is created based on what's required by law and what's been deemed as best practice to protect and reduce risk. So really, the minute you've opened your doors to the public and you have paid staff, you've just, you have a lot of policies that are necessary to govern that situation and manage risk in both of those arenas of your business as a library. So are there one or two on there you might be able to drop? Like, say you don't have a local history collection? Well, sure, you don't need to have a local history policy then, for sure. But be very, very careful when you're picking and choosing, because you might pick and choose one that's required by law. So I think that it's a reality that boards need to face, that you are a policy making body and that your job is to reduce risk and the liabilities that the library is exposed to. And policy making is one of the main ways that you do that work. So I think small, medium, or large size library, they don't write the laws based on how large your library is. They're based on how you're running and what you're producing on behalf of the public. So Ron and Brian, I don't know if you have words of wisdom to add on this one, but I do think you have to have most of those.
I would say that a vast majority of the questions that I get from library directors, my response is generally, what does it say in your policy? I'll get a question like we had earlier in budget and finance about purchase services. And so what does your procurement policy say? And that, just having those policies, and the happy ending to those stories are like, oh, I didn't check. And then they go look, and actually they do have a policy and it's great. And it tells them exactly what to do. Perfect. The not so happy ending to those stories is when they don't have any policies and it causes some issue when they have to move forward and really figure it out. So do it now before you actually need those policies in place. You have a checklist to go through and just start working on those. Most of them you're not going to have to write from scratch. You're going to be able to find samples from other places and then amend them to your library. Make sure that you do review them. Don't just blanket approve library policy without reading them first and making sure that they apply to your situation. But get them in place before you actually need them, and that's going to be a lot more helpful than trying to figure out what to do after the fact when you realize you don't actually have all the policies that you need.
All the questions for today's session are really good, but I like this question as well as one of our upcoming questions around policy development. But within our system, 46 out of 48 sites are considered rural remote, so they're all small libraries. And in consultation with our boards, all our boards do their very best at developing the policies that are within that recommended checklist that's in the trustee handbook, as well as other resources provided by systems out there. And that's kind of like the guidance that I give, is just do the best you can. But in terms of having all those policies, I agree with Rebecca and I agree with Ron in terms of why you need to have them. And it all ties back to that why. So often we'll get those types of questions where this very specific thing happened at our library, and the response that we give is, so what does your policy say about that? And if you don't have that documentation in hand, it's not that you've opened up an even bigger can of worms that you have to deal with, but you've certainly taken away the roadmap as to how you deal with that very specific situation that you're dealing with at this point in time. And so you can't necessarily think of policies as something that are, this exhaustive list of things that you absolutely need to have, but they're more of a roadmap or a guideline as to like how you proactively deal with things before they actually happen. Will all these things actually happen to you all at once? Absolutely not. But when they do happen, and I hear Jerry say this all the time, they will happen. You got to make certain that you have an answer for them. And that's what you're really trying to do, is giving yourself as a board the space and time that you need to come up with the answers to the questions that you're going to have to deal with down the road. So.
Because
I'd love to say-
policies also,
Sorry, sir. Sorry.
policies are essentially just risk management, just like any insurance policy that you would get to. Like you're managing your risk for future issues that may come up. Go ahead, Rebecca. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there.
I was going to say, if the list seems excessive to you, you can also work with your system. Most systems have staff that can help you prioritize the ones that are riskiest not to have. So at least to give you a plan how to methodically work through the ones you don't have.
Nice. So this next question is a little bit related. So do you have advice for a library board that subscribes to the belief that this will never happen here to avoid policy development and the purchase of certain insurance coverages?
Boy, do I have some stories for you. Like, I totally understand the desire not to have to do this kind of work. It's certainly not the favorite part of service for most trustees. But the absolute horror stories we have from across the state of libraries that got caught without a policy or violated their own policy, or something happened that they never could have anticipated, and had their staff been trained just a little bit on a policy area, they could have avoided a lawsuit or someone getting harmed. I mean, these are the kinds of things I don't think you want to leave to chance. So I think that if, that kind of attitude is coming out in the board, oh, that'll never happen here, I don't actually think you're doing your job as a trustee. Your job is to protect the library, to protect the assets of the community, to protect the people that work in your library and come to visit your library. I think you have to have the utmost respect for the need for policies and liability coverage, and really make sure you protect that institution and the people that rely on it and are paid through it.
Duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, like those are the first three things that I thought of when I read through this question, and when I said that I like it, and put aside that whole issue of like, that's never going to happen here, or like, this isn't something we actually really need. You're going to need it. We addressed that in the last question, but going back to the mission of the organization, the Library Bill of Rights, which hopefully all of you subscribe to and approve for your policy manual. And then going back to the trustee handbook, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, these all fall within the structure of why it is that you're at that board table, if not once a month, twice a month, or even more. So, sometimes we just do things because they're the right thing to do, but also the right thing to do sometimes are the things that help us out the most when we need them the most. So.
Nice. And with that, Brian, if I could hand over the next section to you on ethics, conflict of interest, and a few other things.
All right, we're ratcheting it up here a little bit. It's going to get a little bit tougher, I think. So regarding freedom of information for library programs, what if a board says they do not want the library to host programs on certain topics? Wouldn't that be considered censorship?
Yep.
Yes. Yes, it would.
Do we end it there and move on to the next question?
No, next question.
Well said,
question.
easy to go. Yes, it's censorship.
You're in the wrong business if you're going to do that. Get out now.
So let's do that. If a large number of patrons in our community would like a book removed from the library, should we comply with the community's request? And maybe we need to talk through reconsideration of library materials policies, collection management policies, but it's certainly a timely question, but I don't want to assume that we all know the answers to this.
Well, I'll start. And is it a large number of patrons or a loud number of patrons? Therein lies the start of this. Yes, we have to get the policies and institutional selections and all that other stuff. But recently down here on Long Island, if anybody reads, I guess watches the news, reads the New York Times and whatnot, we had a library board, just two trustees at a board meeting, surprised the rest of the board about removing gay pride displays in the library. It was only a week to go in Gay Pride Month. They were coming out anyway. And the library board, because they were told, in quotes, a large number of patrons have been telling me that we shouldn't have this in the library. So the next morning, the director sent a memo out saying you have to remove these materials from or the displays from certain areas of the library. Well, That was, I think, a Monday. On Thursday, they had a special meeting where over 1,000 people went in by Zoom, and it would have been more, but you couldn't get more than 1,000 people in by Zoom. And on the next day, the materials were back. So I'm not sure about large number versus loud number. And subsequently, their board meetings have just been a mess. I mean, it's difficult because it's now become a culture war in the middle of the library. Because the board didn't think it through. They didn't ask for any advice from their professionals. And of course, by the way, the governor has personally directed the Human Rights Commission to investigate the library. So there you go. So be careful about not following a good set policy. Now I'll leave it to the rest of you guys to fill in the blanks, but what a
I think,
nightmare.
this ties into certain policy issues, namely your collection development policy. Some libraries call it your collection management policy, within which is embedded, I would hope, a request for reconsideration procedure. So if you're hearing rumors or, a trustee reports that a large number of people are not happy with something going on at the library, use that policy, use that procedure. You've justified how your collection has been built. We can talk about the same way about programs. Do you have a programming policy that defines why you do programs, who picks those topics, how they make the decisions about those topics? The request for reconsideration procedure can be used for collections or programs, and that procedure should be respected by the board that put it into place. So I think that forcing people just to think through their complaint. Let's actually write down what the complaint is. Let's make sure you've actually read the work in question or attended the program in question or know something that you can base that opinion on. And let's have a transparent conversation about what's going on here. So could a movement arise in your community where 100 people submitted a form and said the same thing, and the board's now faced with an irate crowd? Perhaps a public hearing is necessary to make sure if there's others in the community that have an opinion, recognize that topic is under discussion so we can have a full discussion on that topic. I think that's the board's job, to do that due diligence. But making a decision on hearsay or rumor or perhaps hypothesis of an individual on the board or in the community is, again, not serving the whole community. The library is for everyone. So you're never going to have complete agreement about what's appropriate in all areas of the library's collection or services. But anytime it's challenged, I think the sunshine, the light of day needs to be on that process as much as possible so people understand it's happening, why it's happening, who's driving it, and the board ultimately has to own that authority to make the final decision that's best for the whole community, not perhaps the loud minority that Jerry mentioned.
The one thing I would add to this conversation is just going back to, we answered some questions around that will never happen here. Like when we were talking about policies, and everything that Rebecca and Jerry just talked about also ties down to practicing procedures. When we talked about emergency preparedness and making sure staff have those muscle memories, so that when a person issues or fills out that reconsideration for library materials form, how does the staff respond to that patron when they're issuing that concern? Or how does the director work with staff or also receive that concern? And then most importantly, because we're working and talking with trustees, how do you as trustees receive that form? And it's all about proactive measures through not only your policy development, but what does it look like when you as trustees go through a mock situation of receiving that form in an open public meeting and responding in the way that upholds not only the Library Bill of Rights, but our core values as a profession, and know that you're responding in a way where even though some members of your community or the vocal members of your community don't agree with your decision making, at the very least they can respect you for your decision making because you've upheld that policy based on decisions that you made long before the heat of the moment. So
I just want to say I'm proud to be part of the Public Library System Directors Organization, of which Brian and Ron are also a member, and Jerry is a former member of. We all voted unanimously to help underwrite a project along with other types of systems across the state called the Public Library Collection Management Policy Template and Guide. So now we have a New York State specific guide for you. If you don't have a strong collection management policy, or you don't have a request for reconsideration procedure, or you're in the midst of reviewing yours, which you should be if you haven't reviewed reviewed it in the past year or two. So that resource will be amended to the page where you find this recording, so you have access to that. Really strong way to start a good review that's specific to not only federal law, professional best practice, but also New York State issues.
Okay, so I think this leads us into our next question, and hopefully we've built the groundwork for answering this question. But in regards to collective authority, when the board passes a motion in favor of censorship, what should a dissenting trustee do when the decision disagrees with personal values and the core tenets of the library?
I'll start this one because it comes up a lot. And you have First Amendment rights as an individual, as a citizen of the United States of America, and you can exercise them and express your opinion. That said, it's not in the best interest of the institution, for sure, if you are standing up at a public meeting saying, I'm a library trustee and I don't like what the library board did. You can stand up at a public meeting and say, I'm a member of this community and I do not believe what the library board's decision regarding fill in the blank is in our best interests and whatever, and provide arguments to that. I think in some cases, actually, ironically, usually I've had this question over the years when a library trustee did not want to go along with a building project. This one, I think, has more to do with does not want to go on with the censorship issue. In which case that's a very noble cause, and I hope you stand up. But you have that right, but not as a trustee, as a citizen. That's where your right is, and I applaud anyone who has the courage to do that and doesn't mix the two jobs.
Yeah, I appreciate that this question came out. It's so timely given with what libraries are faced with in the country today. I really would hope that before you got to this moment, the board has reviewed what the true meaning of consensus is, that you understand that it's not unanimity on a topic, but it's that I've been heard, you've been heard, and we've made a decision. And even if I would have preferred a different decision, that you're agreeing to go along. And then if you feel you weren't heard, I think that's also something to consider and speak about process with the board president or the facilitator of your meeting. So, I think of the Supreme Court, right? They write dissensions of when they do not agree with the majority opinion in a situation. So they're on record with why. And sometimes that's necessary in a situation with a weaker facilitator where you were not heard fully in a discourse. So when Jerry was describing the case study used in the question before this, one of the problems was a process was not followed to have an item for discussion on agenda with plenty of time for people to research the issue so they were informed for a discussion. So I think that's something else to consider in this situation, was proper process used to have a discussion and come to a decision that was based on true consensus. That's something to consider if your board's not perhaps getting along well, or you're having votes that are surprising to people.
Actually, going back to that previous case study, there were certain board members that publicly objected to the action of the board and felt they had to because, and I'm using the key term in this question was core tenets of the library. If they, if you're really going off the rails, they felt they were doing their job to speak out and say, this is not what we believe in. This is not what the library's all about. And in the end, they won, although nobody won, to be honest with you. It's just going to go fester now for probably years.
I agree with you, Jerry. I actually logged on to that meeting. I was one of the 1,000 who got into that meeting. I did so from Washington, D.C. at the ALA conference because I thought it was such a critical issue. And the damage done through that conversation to that community is really heartbreaking. But I'm thankful for the folks that spoke up and fought for people who have a right to be seen and heard in the library.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so final question on the topic. How can Association Library become more transparent with its funding and selection of trustees? I half joke here, but don't they just become a school district public library or a special legislative district library?
That would be ideal, but we all know there's association libraries out there that aren't interested in that path forward. But we advise all of our association libraries to have a public vote on their funding, have the taxpayers have their say of how much of their taxes are going towards the library. And coupled with that, I know this is not popular for me to say and push, but there should be a public election of trustees. If you are receiving public dollars, I think public elections are important. Taxation with representation is a mantra in our country that I think should apply to all types of libraries. And you can affect a public election of trustee situation through an association library's bylaws. We've done that here for one of our association libraries. And I do think it's going to become more of a flashpoint issue moving forward when association libraries are fighting for other rights that public libraries have. If you're not willing to pull the trigger and have a trustee election, I think it calls into question the transparency commitment that a board may have. Now, you may not be thinking that way as an association library. You're just thinking, we're just lucky to have the volunteers we have. And, you know, it's hard to recruit folks to get on the board. But I think even the bylaw-laden way to elect your trustees as an association library is an important way to help anyone understand they too could become a member of this association library board, and that it's not an insiders club with a special group of people making decisions about public tax dollars.
I might just add that in our strategy document that Rebecca and I did for the Division of Library Development recently, we actually give you 3 different scenarios of how to amend your bylaws in order to provide a public vote, along with the mechanics. It's doable, that's all. And it's smart, frankly. And watch your budget grow when you start doing that.
All right, our next section of questions that we have is my personal favorite, planning and evaluation. I love planning, I love projects, I love evaluations, but the first question that we have here is, what is the right size plan, or how many goals should be created? It seems like if we create too many goals, then everyone will get overwhelmed, but if we create too few goals, we will miss out on opportunities to serve the community, or we did a lot of planning work for a little output. So if you don't mind, I'd love to jump on this first, and then I'll hand it off. And what I have to say about this one is a lot of it depends on the community, the information that you got from the community, what your target objectives are for that actual plan. I think that the question here is absolutely right. It's hard to kind of figure out that right number. Typically, when I'm working with libraries on this, I say to have 3 to 5 kind of overarching goals that they're going to have, and the goals in a plan are typically those broad statements that are supporting the mission of the library or the values of the library. So these 3 to 5 larger goals that you're going to have are then going to be supported by objectives, which essentially are projects. So these are specific things that are tasks or projects that support what you're trying to do in terms of the outcomes. And then underneath that are going to be the action steps, or those specific activities that as you do them, it builds to the objectives. So when you're thinking about this, and you're thinking about these 3 to 5 goals that you have that you want to use to be able to further the mission of your library, break them up a bit. So you have your goals, then you have your objectives, which are the projects, then those individual tasks that you're going to be able to do to actually accomplish those. And then what the question doesn't ask, but I'll say anyway, is once you have all that stuff put together, you need to figure out that evaluation metric on it too, because being able to assess all of how well those goals hit or how well those objectives did, and make sure that you are taking a look critically at all these things so you can better learn for the future of what you want to do, is going to be a really good step to be able to consider. And when you're collecting all this information, you're going through, when you're talking with the community and getting ideas, you're going to get way more ideas than you're actually going to be able to implement in the life of a single plan. And that's okay. The shelf life on those lasts a while. You can use those in the future when you reevaluate your plan, when you talk to some more people about it. So it's very useful to have those. Don't feel like you have to accomplish everything, because a lot of it has to do with the capacity that you have at the library, but make sure you have the things that are supporting those missions, the visions, the long-term goals of what the organization's trying to do. And I'll hand it over to see if other people have comments on that too.
Every time I hear you talk about this, Ron, I think about how lucky your member libraries are to have you. You're very, very good at helping make this doable and understandable. I had 2 things to add to what you said. One is just, at the outside of your planning process, just remember you cannot be everything to everyone, right? You've got to focus your energy and apply your resources in a way to the best advantage of your community. So when folks say like, oh, we should have 10 goals because there's so many things to do, you can't do all those things equally well. You're going to have to winnow it down to those things that you can truly make an impact on, and the library is well positioned to contribute to. The other big thing that I see kind of where you get a little messy with planning is when folks mix up their strategic plan with their operational plan. So you'll see that in the midst of helping to solve world hunger, you're also needing to get a new boiler. So remembering that you want to keep your strategic plan at that goal level oriented to what impact you're going to have on the community, and then having different operational plans related to your facility, your staffing capacity, or your professional development of your staff to meet the needs of the community in your strategic goal. That's a different type of planning.
So in the in plans, and Rebecca, you hit on this a bit, what items should be included in every plan created by the library? I imagine things like facilities and funding. Are other items added as we see fit, or are there other things that should be included in your library's long-range plan?
So I just like how I gave the segue to this one. It's because I forgot we were going to have this question. Yeah, thanks.
That's all right. It's perfect.
So I think that, you know, in a strategic plan where you're setting the goals for how you will help the community reach their aspirations, I don't think there should be repetition in how that's going to happen, because each community may need something different. But if we're talking about your operational plan where you're thinking about multi-year financial planning or a capital plan to make sure you're a good steward of the facility, those are two types of plans that every library absolutely should have, along with a professional development plan for staff that helps to underpin the strategic plan that the board has adopted. So in a way, you're thinking about your strategic plan, which is how you're going to orient the entire organization to go in this direction. But then you have these auxiliary plans that back that up to make sure the staff actually have the capacity, that you actually have the funding to make things happen, that your building actually holds up under the test of what the community needs for it. So there might be a different way to think of planning to separate those things out from each other.
It's a beautiful answer. I like it a lot.
Rob, the one thing I'd add to the conversation is we were interviewing one time for a professional position, and when we were going through that process, we were just asking candidates like what they knew about our organization. And one of the candidates who actually got hired, and they've been with us for quite some time now, and they're doing great work. They said, "I love the fact that you just have a plan. Like I've applied for lots of positions, and I've gone to their website and I've looked for the plan, and there's no plan. I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing when I come to this organization." And, you know, this person said, before I even like applied for the job, I knew what you were working on. I knew what your organizational culture was like. And I knew that you had this idea of where you wanted to be in the next 5 years. And so, you know, I don't think sometimes when trustees or even directors or even staff get bogged down into the details of creating a plan, they don't realize who's watching or who's looking. And you can really build huge support from your community just by developing the plan by itself. And that's not to say you shouldn't follow all the details that Ron and Rebecca have mentioned here, but it does show that you care, like you're exercising that duty of care by just having a plan.
Nice. The last question in this section, which I like this one too, is it acceptable to update the library's long-range plan mid-year after we assess what has been accomplished and what will most likely not be accomplished by the end of the year? What do you think, Rebecca?
I think if you're not doing this, perhaps you're not carrying out the plan in the best possible way. So I definitely think mid-year check-ins are good. We do that here at the Mid-Hudson Library System. I just made my report to my board of our mid-year plan, and we adjusted a couple of things. Our action plan that underpins our long-range plan. We needed to think about our staffing capacity. We've had some staff turnover. Our funding situation didn't quite go the way we expect it to. In fact, we had some more options than we thought we would at the beginning of the year. So if you don't take that time to assess what's going on, you can't fine tune that plan and get it to the best advantage of the people that you serve. So I think, you know, I wonder if a director asked this question because of the way it's worded in terms of, you know, making the case for what's not going to get done by the end of the year. I want to make sure people understand. I think it is important to convey to a board that they have realistic expectations for what's going to be doable by the end of the year, and to be understanding that adjustments will be necessary. And if you wait till the end of a 5-year plan to do that retrospective, how much time and energy and money have you wasted after 5 years? So I think every 6 months revisiting it, checking in, course correcting if necessary, and moving forward is really smart.
I've learned so much about just organizational capacity by doing this, just regularly taking a look at the plan and having a realistic expectation for what's going to be done by the end of the year. Or if I see that there's a project that's significantly lagging, I can take a look at it and see, like, what is it? Because it's probably not that people just aren't doing the work. It's probably that there's some type of hurdle that is causing some issues, and maybe that'll need an adjustment, maybe that'll need some more attention. So it's a wonderful and kind of built-in way to make sure that you are accomplishing what you need to, but then also understanding a little bit better the capacity that you need in order to make sure that you accomplish the rest of the things too that you set out to do.
One of the things that we all are aware of is that having a strategic plan is part of like our minimum standards as libraries in New York State. And I think Jerry said something about this before, where like it's not, and I know I'm countering what I just said, but like it's not good enough just to have the plan and then put it on a shelf. Like you have to be engaged with it. And so whether that's like regular check-ins with either project managers of those goals or staff that are charged with doing those goals, not necessarily through their evaluation process, because I don't think that would be fair to them, but I think checking in with the people that are responsible for doing the things on a consistent basis, whether it's quarterly or monthly or whatever it might be to get the work done, I think that's important, but definitely not allowing more than a year to go by. And then also doing the assessment after a year, like what were the goals, how far into them are we, how much how many impacts have we had, and then also like some narrative process to that, like writing down like what is it that we've actually accomplished, so that we can share that with our community and say, hey, 12 months, we're 12 months in this plan, we've done all these wonderful things, here's all the programs or services that you've enjoyed, post it out through social media, up on your website, press releases, letting the entire community know that their taxpayer dollars are going to really good work. And thank you. That's a great segue to PR and advocacy, right? Isn't it? All right, nodding heads. I like it. If our school district public library receives all of its funding from our tax levy, why does our system ask us to advocate for library funding each year? I'm assuming that's state funding.
So I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I have a lot of practice talking about this since I work at a system. But the way I think about it is that state funding helps local libraries go further and to make local library services affordable to taxpayers. So when you say, oh, we receive all of our funding from our tax levy, that's not actually true, because a lot of your ability to carry out services the way you do is thanks to money that's been leveraged from the state level on your constituents' behalf through the system infrastructure. So when we actually took a look at our system services here at Mid-Hudson, the utilization of state money to underwrite an ILS, to underwrite continuing education and consulting, to underwrite the delivery system. If our members had to do all of that work without us, it would actually cost them 10 times as much as it does by us all working together collaboratively. So when you think about asking your public for a budget that's 10 times as high as it is today, I wonder if you would be as well funded in that scenario as you are right now. So I think when you're budgeting, it's always important to think about the in-kind services that make your budget doable. And that could be from your town plowing your library's parking lot to your system using state money to underwrite the software that runs your library. All those things need to be considered by a board when you think of your budget as a whole. So understanding that part of a trustee's responsibility is to be very reasonable when it comes to taxpayer dollars, and talking about local tax dollars going to the maximum advantage requires you to leverage county, state, and federal money to the best advantage, and systems are a multiplier that help you do that.
This question, the way it's asked, I look at it as it's a narrow view of the library community in general, because as Rebecca's saying, like that money impacts a lot of different places. So yeah, you may have funding locally, but libraries is a very large microcosm of organisms that work together. And in New York State, all of the public libraries are interconnected more or less through money or some other way. And if something happens at a library in this part of the state, we're going to look at that. It may have an impact on what we're doing too. So it's a broad situation of the library community. And when we're talking with our legislators and the people who are advocating for libraries, it just makes that library community stronger. And when that happens, it benefits all the libraries that we're talking about here in New York.
Yeah, and
I know. Follow up on, please, Brian, you go.
So I know that we're all wearing library system hats, and that's part of the thing that we need to do is go out and advocate. But I think the 3 points that I'd like to convey to this question is, we do those library calculators, and we know what the return on investment is for our local libraries to our community members. We also know that same return on investment exists for library systems to our local libraries. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is construction aid, and that's all I really have to say about that. It's really important that we advocate for those direct funds to our local libraries. And the third thing I'll say, I know this doesn't apply to all library systems in the state, but for Southern Tier Library System, like many systems in the state, we're a cooperative library system. We're here because of our members. I mean, back in the 1950s, local libraries stood up and said, hey, we need somebody that is representing us on our behalf at the state level and providing us shared services so that we can do all the things that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of answering this question. And so without the public library systems here, or systems in New York State in general, we wouldn't be seeing that great return on investment, and you would have to be picking up those costs, tremendous costs at the local levels.
I'd like to chime in a little bit and say that agree with Ron, this is a little narrow because the fact of the matter is you're not just lobbying for funding, you're advocating for libraries. And at least in my professional career, which is long now, the money was not the most important part. The exposure, the contacts, the friendships, the understanding of what we did was what's the most important. So you're a school district library. If our predecessors had not been doing this and making friends in Albany, there would not be an Education Law 267, 8, 9, 10, and 11. In other words, you would not be independent. And all of the wonderful legal protections you have and your own budget and your own ability to hire architects and build buildings and require school districts to bond for you wouldn't exist. And so that's why you're up there. I mean, the dormitory, right now you're getting state construction aid, right? And you get it through the dormitory authority. How do you think that happened? A library system director who was paid by state funds worked on behalf of their libraries and worked with state legislators and enabled the dormitory authority to be an access point for funding for libraries. And that's what it's all about. It's the whole package, not just a couple of bucks. Yes, systems can use the money, but frankly, the bills that get passed, the special library district bills, which we believe will be passed again pretty soon, and all of that other legislation that comes through, that's important. And you need that in order to protect your institution and have it grow. So please don't just think about the dollars. It's important, but it's not the only reason we do this.
Jerry, as you say that, I start to think about, the 414 legislation, which helps now to fund half my libraries. It wasn't there before 1995. Or when I think about how the property tax cap law was interpreted on behalf of libraries, without the advocacy that we all did, how that impacts local libraries will look a lot different today. So I think it's good to think about the influence of legislation and state decisions on local funding, as well as the dollars that come through the systems.
A trustee on our board reviews the voting history of our legislators. A recent upset was that one of our representatives voted against the Guns and Sensitive Locations bill that included libraries. This most likely has deep political reasons, but should the library write a letter indicating our feelings on this topic? So a letter to the legislator.
I'll be quick. This is not a culture warrior partisan issue. This is a health and safety issue for your patrons and your staff. And if you don't fight for them, who will? I personally and professionally think it's disgraceful that they would not vote to provide your organization with the kind of protection that they would want. And if their own grandchild was going into your library building, I'm damn sure that they don't really want people walking in with guns. So yes, stand up for your institution. It's not a political issue. It's about the safety of your patrons, your community, and your staff. That's all I can say. Yes. And you know what? So they don't like it. Big deal. I'm done.
Do we leave it on that? And we'll head to the last question. Okay. I like this question. I think it's a good one to end on. Our social media has a poor interaction, usually 1 to 6 likes to post. The library does not have the funding or staff time to dedicate to our social media platforms. Should we reprioritize to make this happen? Personally, I feel going out into the community, interacting with patrons has a higher ROI than posting on social media. Sounds like a personal opinion.
Well, I think this is a bigger issue than libraries like to admit, because I think there's staff who enjoy social media, and so taking on social media, what they consider responsibilities, seems like a no-brainer. I can just integrate this into my work when I'm on there personally anyway, and then not taking the time to understand that that is one of more than a dozen ways we connect with folks in our community. So I think there's actually a diagnosis here that's necessary. It might not be that it's one or the other, social media or being in the community. It may mean a more comprehensive communication plan is necessary to understand where people in the community are actually connecting with information. You absolutely have a segment of your population who is getting local information through social media channels. And so understanding which type of information to be getting out through that mode of communication is going to be very important. And that may mean education for staff to help them make decisions of where to use precious time and energy to get the word out. Absolutely nothing beats word of mouth marketing. And that may mean both being out in the community and the word of mouth that's garnered through social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook or other means that might be popular in your region. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's a black and white issue. I do think most libraries need to spend more time being strategic, though, about which modes they're using, how they're using them, and setting some goals for themselves so they can measure the effectiveness of what they're doing in all modes of communication. So I do think it's something that libraries and perhaps boards as well just kind of left to chance. And you might have just gotten lucky and had a staff person that happened to be good at one type of communication mode or another for PR. But we have to be much more strategic about this, given the multi-level channels that are out there these days to get the word out. So the thing that caught my eye in this question was when the person asking said, the library doesn't have funding or staff time to dedicate to our social media platforms. I thought that was almost a flippant kind of comment. Well, is that true? Do you actually have staff time and energy to promote anything going on in your community? Because I know in some of my member library communities, the #1 way people find out what's going on is through an event listing in Facebook. So this question makes me a little nervous. It makes me think you need to take a deeper dive on this issue for folks. And it's not that I'm a big fan of social media myself. It's a tool to get a job done. And so understanding what the job is to get done and how to use it to your best advantage is the job at hand. No one else wants to weigh in on that one? Thanks, guys.
I think we're going to let you end on a high note. I think it's better than any of us. So thank you, Rebecca.
All right, you're welcome.
All right, well, that brings us to the end to our series of questions for the second after party. So that's how good we're getting, is we actually have had 2 after parties after doing tons of live sessions between fall of 2021 through spring of 2022. We just want to thank everybody for supporting us through this initial project rollout. I know we've been working on it for more than a year now, in addition to just doing these live sessions and after parties, but doing a lot of meetings online, planning to engage with all of you and have this wonderful dialogue and support you in the work as public library trustees in New York State. So we hope you'll continue to follow us through this project. We actually have more content coming. We're looking at rolling out more live sessions in the fall, winter of 2022. We're going to dive into additional topics that come out of the Trustee Handbook, as well as some other library-related topics that should help all of you as trustees. Just as a reminder, while we do take an abbreviated break until we bring out more content, you can find all of our resources on the Mid-Hudson Library Systems website. If you visit midhudson.org/trustee book club. We also encourage all trustees to reach out to the public library system for everyday support. That's what we're here for. And then also, most importantly, we hope everyone stays healthy and well in the coming weeks and months. Thanks for your ongoing engagement in this project, and thank you for serving as a public library trustee in New York State. Thanks, everyone. Take care and be well.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Pleasure.